Hey, what's up, Brew Crew? Opie here. Welcome back to my Brew City Garden. So I'm just getting ready to start the conditioning process, which is going to require a high nitrogen fertilizer and water to put on these bales to facilitate the composting process or the conditioning process. And I want to talk about what sources of nitrogen you might want to use on your bales. All right, so I'm ready to start the conditioning process, which, just to break it down, is basically the internal composting of these bales. So the way these bales sit right now, they're pretty inert. There's not a lot of nutritional value to them. And if I just wanted to plug a plant in there now and water it, it's gonna die pretty quickly because there's no nutrients for that plant to take up. Through the conditioning process, what we're gonna do is we're gonna add water and nitrogen to the bales. And what that's going to do is it's going to wake up the bacteria and other microbes that live inside these bales, and they're going to start feeding on that nitrogen. And very quickly, they're going to reproduce and colonize that whole bale and begin to break that straw down. And that straw will then release its micro and macronutrients that are then able to be taken up by the plants. And it just turns into this wonderful, wonderful growing medium that I just love so much. So what kind of nitrogen can you use? Well, really the choice is yours. You can go the organic route if you'd like, or you can use traditional fertilizers. I use the traditional fertilizers only because the organics tend to get pretty expensive when you get a garden that's my size. I've got 40 plus bales this year, and if I wanted to use, let's say, blood meal, it would cost me well over $100 just to condition my bales. Using blood meal, because it takes so much, and as you might know, organic nutrients aren't exactly cheap. But you can certainly use blood meal or feather meal or really any other type of nitrogen source that you want. I would say stay away from manures, only because one, they don't smell very good. Two, it takes a lot of manure to activate your bales, to condition your bales. And three, there's always that small possibility of pathogens that you just want to avoid. So again, I find traditional fertilizers a lot easier. They're a lot more friendly on my pocketbook. So that's the route I always go. And to be honest with you, the plants, they can't tell the difference. The plants don't care. They're going to take up those nutrients either way. They don't know if they're organic or if they're a chemical fertilizer. The plants, they just don't care. Now, if you're in search for a high nitrogen fertilizer, just quickly, you can go to a big box store, say Home Depot or Lowe's or your Ace Hardware store, and you want to look in their lawn food section, their lawn fertilizer section. And that's where you're going to find the high nitrogen fertilizer sources. Now, you need to be careful when you're picking out your high nitrogen fertilizer, because a lot of these lawn foods are going to be a weed and feed type of product. Now, you want to stay away from the weed and feed. Do not use a weed and feed, because that herbicide that's in that fertilizer will kill anything you try to plant in your bales. So it's extremely important. Do not use a weed and feed fertilizer. Another thing you want to try to stay away from is a time-released fertilizer. Now, depending on, and you can usually tell by the price of your fertilizer, the more expensive it is, the better quality that fertilizer typically is, and the better the time release works. I tend to go for the absolute cheapest fertilizer I can find, and it just so happens that it works the best for conditioning your bales. Now, on those cheap fertilizers, it may say, it might say 50% slow released nitrogen, which is kind of misleading. What it is, they put a coating on the nitrogen to make it so where that every time it rains, a little bit of that nitrogen seeps into the lawn and it helps fertilize your lawn. But the secret to conditioning your bales with it is we're coming back and we're going to water this every day anyway, which is going to wash that fertilizer into the bales. It's going to work out perfectly for you. Now, in some instances, you might have access to just a pure urea nitrogen, which are usually found at like farmers co-ops. Some large nurseries will have it. And of course, you can order it online depending on where you live. There are some regulations around the pure urea nitrogen, but if you can get that, that works extremely well too. And you could even cut the recipe that I'm going to use in half if you're using urea nitrogen, just because it's such a potent pure form of nitrogen. So what am I using? Well, let's take a look. So here's the lawn fertilizer, the nitrogen source that I'm using now. I've been using this exact same fertilizer for the last 4 or more years, and it works out perfectly. Essentially, it's a Vigoro brand lawn fertilizer, and this is the cheapest fertilizer that they offer. And if you look down here in the corner, you can see that it is 29% nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, and 4% potassium or potash. Now, if you look down here at the bottom, it says contains time-released nitrogen for extended feeding. Now, this is what I was talking about before, that there's a coating on this nitrogen that releases it, that helps release that nitrogen every time it rains. And again, we're going to come back and we're going to water these bales every day. It's going to wash this nitrogen in without any problems. Now, let me turn this bag over and we'll take a closer look at what kind of nitrogen is actually in this. All right, so on the back of most fertilizer brands, you're going to find their guaranteed analysis. And if we take a look at this one, we can see that there's 21.2% urea nitrogen, and there's 7.2% other water-soluble nitrogen. Now, urea nitrogen itself is water-soluble. It's very fast-acting. And then the 7.2% other water-soluble nitrogen, again, as long as it's water-soluble, that's a very fast-acting nitrogen. It's going to work perfect for our conditioning purposes. And if we look underneath that yet, it says 0.6% water-insoluble nitrogen. This is definitely a slow-release nitrogen, which is what we don't want. However, there's only 0.6% water-insoluble nitrogen in this bag. That's nothing. That's not a big deal whatsoever. It's not going to make any difference. Now, as far as phosphorus, there's 0% phosphorus in here. At this point in conditioning, we're not worried about phosphorus, and we're not worried about potassium either. We just want that nitrogen in the bales to help the bacteria colonize the bales and break it down. So even though there is 0% phosphorus and only 4% potassium, that makes no difference to us whatsoever. It's the nitrogen that we are after. This stuff works perfectly. There are several store brands that are the exact same formula. So no matter where you go, I know Scott's makes the same formula. Ace Hardware has their store formula that's the same. And there's a few others out there. So as long as your guaranteed analysis is something close to this, and it's not a weed and feed, you're good to go. All right, guys, so now that you know what kind of nitrogen I am going to use to condition my bales, hopefully that helps you out a little bit as far as figuring out what type of nitrogen you want to use. Again, as long as it's a high nitrogen source, it really doesn't matter what you use. Make sure you stay away from the weed and feed, however, because that's not going to work in your garden. I tell you what, if you've got any suggestions, or let me know what type of high nitrogen fertilizer you're using in your garden, leave it in the comments below. I'm always looking for new ideas, so if you've got something that I'm not aware of, I would love to hear about it. Hey, do me a favor, hit that like button down there, and if you're new here, hit that subscribe button so you can follow along with the Brew City Garden for the rest of the 2019 season. I think you'll be amazed at what you see. All right, guys, stick around because it's time to start the conditioning process. You don't want to miss it. Make sure you follow along with me. All right, guys, we'll see you.